Hey everybody, this is Jason Wilson with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. Today I am joined with my good friend and dispensary owner, Gregg Kerr. We're here at Fireside Dispensary filming on location. Thanks so much, Gregg, for being willing to sit down with me and chat about all of the issues that you experience in the cannabis industry as a dispensary owner.
My pleasure, Jason. It's always a pleasure talking to you, giving you my insight.
Yeah, I really look forward to diving into what we've got going on here. Before we get started with some of the deeper content, do you mind just kind of briefly explaining what got you into wanting to run a dispensary? And then I think from there we can kind of talk about maybe some of the challenges and issues that you've kind of run into over the years.
I was a lineman for PG&E Utility in California. The corporate mannerisms, the corporate structure wasn't working for me morally anymore.
Yeah.
I won't get into it. And I had always been into cannabis. I tried cannabis when I was 14 and consumed until I got my job at PG&E, and then kind of here and there. Then when that job started to fall apart, I decided to move forward with cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
My wife at the time, Jamie, wanted to go forward with cannabis as well. We saw it as a opportunity, something that we were passionate about and something that could provide. So September 12th, 2009, me and her opened up 530 Cannabis, Shasta County.
Wow. So that's quite a while back now. You've been doing this for basically a decade.
Coming up on 10 years this September.
Yeah.
It was right when Obama said leave everybody alone. If states are willing to regulate, then the feds would back off. So the city that we operate in allowed us to operate. It's kind of funny, they gave out 2 licenses,
Wow.
then put up a moratorium, and then developed an ordinance for dispensaries in the town. So we were actually operating when they were developing.
Wow, so you were one of those first 2.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
So we got to take full part of every planning commission meeting
Yeah.
and city council meeting, and helped try and direct them a little bit in some of their weird ways that they were thinking, give them other instances that they might think about. So we got to help develop an ordinance in that town. My partner down there, ex-wife, is actually one of the planning commissioners in that town now.
Wow.
That's how far we took it and got involved with everything. And then me and her got divorced. So friendly divorce, we're still friends, thank God, and we
Yeah.
still run 530. Wonderful friendship still, thank God. With that, operating in California for 6 years at the time, being without regulation, operating in a gray area basically. I came to Oregon looking for regulation. I wanted to be regulated.
Interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to know what I could or could not do. Operating in California, we took the standard of, if we had to come up with an issue, we would look at other industries. What would they do for this type of problem? And then go up and above and beyond that with our solution, and got our lawyer approval. That way, if it ever went to court or was ever challenged, we could say, well, we looked at this and we went above that to
Right.
try and prove legitimacy. So operating like that, and is this okay, is that not okay kind of world, I wanted regulation.
Right.
I
Get
wanted
things
to be able
more
to hold
clear
my head
cut.
up a little bit higher.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that translated really well, just that mentality coming into Oregon when you did, when the rules were changing to actually allow dispensaries and all of that, that you had already had some of that experience getting a dispensary going in an area with lack of regulation, working with planning commissioners and everything to get rules set up, and then coming here and kind of just extending that a step further. And what was that transition like coming from California to Oregon?
A little bit scary. The town I operate in down there, I'd lived there for 10 years or so before I opened up my business down there. So I was already established within the community, working for the electrical department, get around the county a little bit. Coming up here, not knowing anybody, not having any friends here, just shooting in the dark, so to speak.
Yep.
Was definitely more of a mental challenge than anything. The city of Phoenix was good to work with. slightly challenging, but still good to work with. I like the way they regulated us so far. No complaints there. More just the mental challenge of kind of being by myself and trying to figure out everything by myself. I went to a lot of counties and cities to see where I could operate or where they were allowing operations. A lot of doors slammed in the face. I remember Grants Pass was pretty negative
At the time,
Yeah, that wasn't a good good rapport with them at all. But I think just the beginning, the initial few weeks, once I had a direction of what I could do and where I could do it, I just kind of put my nose to the grind, and the worries kind of went away
yeah,
for the most part.
yeah. Well, I know one of the things that attracted me to your dispensary the first time that you and I met, and I was able to. I mean, I saw this place when you were building it out. And getting it all prepared, I was impressed by the level of professionalism that you were going for with your establishment and the overall just mentality that you were bringing, not just with yourself, but your employees and everything, and trying to make it very, very clear that you were kind of a different dispensary than what a lot of people were accustomed to. Because hearing you talk about moving, I resonate with that a lot because, you know, when I moved out here from Mississippi, it was very similar. I didn't know anybody, didn't know the place. And the first 6 months are probably the hardest. Definitely the first year is pretty hard, just adjusting and the whole, trying to figure out how to nourish yourself and all of that,
Totally.
while trying to achieve your professional goals and everything. And it's a lot to handle. But I remember when I moved out here, there was kind of a clandestine dispensary environment under the medical program, based around donations. And a lot of, when I first moved here, I got my medical card and did a little bit of a tour on all the dispensaries that were operating at the time. And most of them were pretty sketchy. And they did not seem to be going for the same level of quality that that I see here, and like now I'm seeing replicated in more and more dispensaries, that people are taking it much more seriously and trying to raise the, trying to improve the perception that cannabis has broadly and these establishments have. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about are the demographics of people that you see coming into the dispensary.
Definitely.
Because I know when those dispensaries were operating the medical program, a lot of people shied away from them because they were kind of sketchy. They weren't very inviting for certain demographics of cannabis users that, folks that are middle-aged or very conservative that are interested usually in the therapeutic qualities of cannabis but don't want to go anywhere near a dispensary. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like, what are the different kind of spectrum of people that you see come through the dispensary, and we'll go from there.
I think the medical program stunted a lot of people, and the fact that the cost of everything, it was roughly $400 by the time you saw the doctor and went to Oregon to get your card. It was roughly $400 a year annually. So I think that shied a lot of people away. And then, just the whole, it's a drug,
Right.
Not wanting to be in the limelight of marijuana. Definitely kept a lot of people away, a lot of professionals. There was always a huge misconception that when you got your state card or a recommendation from the doctor, that your name went into some database somewhere.
Right.
And the HIPAA laws apply, and a lot of people didn't understand that anybody can get access to their name, so to speak, and I'm on a user list.
Right, that information's heavily protected, just like any medical information.
Exactly. Yeah, it's between you and your doctor type thing. So I think that those were the main contributors to people shying away in the medical, for sure. The demographics of people stayed pretty much the same, just in larger volumes. Young people all the way through old people. My mom works here now, a couple days a week, part-time.
Wow.
At a receptionist level. And it was eye-opening to her how many over 55 people come in.
Yeah.
So I see that segment getting more and more populated,
Mm-hmm.
people over 55. So it's a pretty wide demographic of people that actually come in.
And do you know?
Wider than most people would anticipate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, certainly, I think there's a perception that from anyone that's kind of outside the industry or areas where cannabis is legal, that most of the people that are taking advantage of cannabis laws are people that are 30 and younger, 40 and younger.
Hoodlums.
And hoodlums, yeah, yep. And it was my experience working in the testing lab in the early days, getting the testing labs going. When we were working actually with patients directly, it became very clear that actually a lot of these people are older. A lot of them are dealing with very serious issues and are trying to kind of make their way, figure things out in regards to cannabis.
Definitely.
And heard some amazing stories that blew my mind wide open when it came to thinking about who's using cannabis and why and that sort of thing. Do you notice any patterns on the types of products that different demographics of users are gravitating towards? Like, do you notice the 55 and up crowd, are they using different products than some of the younger folks that are coming in?
Still pretty good variable amongst the age groups, but definitely there's slight, what would you call it? Slight segments where people,
Mm-hmm.
demographics were geared towards. Carts. Certain people like the carts.
Like vape cartridges?
The vape carts. Topicals are usually a certain segment of people. Edibles. Edibles are such a small segment of the market.
Really?
It's pretty broad on who uses edibles. RSO is a huge product being sold right now. Huge volumes, if you will. With the edibles only being at 50 milligrams.
Because of the potency limits.
Potency, yeah. People are able to get 600-800 milligrams in a syringe, 1 gram.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the medical crowd definitely headed that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Cost effectiveness.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I can imagine it'd be super expensive to try to maintain a stock of edibles if you're needing, high potency regularly.
It'd be astronomical if you try to do something medically with
Yeah.
edibles.
Yeah. Do you, on the topic of edibles, do you get many people reporting bad experiences with edibles?
I hear a lot in other states. I haven't heard too much in Oregon, and I haven't had any instances here that I can speak of.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like people that are buying the heavier stuff, the RSO, the higher milligram dosages, have an understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah, and probably already have a tolerance kind of built up that.
Yeah, they've used cannabis before, typically.
Yeah, because I know that's been one of the concerns that I hear, just particularly with the edibles, because it's so easy to take too much for anyone that's starting out.
I think Colorado's had the most problems with that. I think their admissions to the ER room with via cannabis
they've gone up for sure.
been astronomical. But they're still selling 1,000 milligram edibles at the shelf.
So that's a really important distinction to note for our listeners, that here in Oregon, where we are, there are strict potency limits on all products. And yeah, for edibles, you can only put so much. I can't remember exactly what the limit is. Is it 50 milligrams?
50 milligrams for rec, yeah.
Yeah, and so in other states that may not be the case. And so the edibles that someone may get in one state can be extremely, extremely different as far as risk compared to another. Yeah.
Extremely.
I remember one time I was at an event here in Oregon, but it was before the rules were really solidified the way they are now. And it was one of those fairs where vendors come out, and someone had these, it was at least 400 milligrams, if not more, these candy bars. And this person, I was there talking about testing services and technologies at the time, but this lady came up to me and said, would you mind talking to my mother? She's looking at products and needs to understand what she's getting into. Would you mind talking to her? I was like, sure, yeah, bring her by. And a little later on, this little old lady hooked up to an oxygen tank came up to me. She's like 82 years old and the nicest lady. And she pulls out of her bag. She said, someone gave me this and said it would help. Can you tell me anything about it? And I looked at it, and it was a candy bar, 400 milligrams in the candy bar. And she had never taken an edible before.
That's worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you came and talked to us because, like, you need to be extremely careful with this. And I think they had told her to break it in half or something, they were like portion it out. But even that, 200 milligrams, even if you broke it into fourths, you're still 100 milligrams, which is still too much for...
I know people that get uncomfortable after 10 milligrams.
Yes, yeah.
Definitely. So
yeah.
Even 50 milligrams for an 82-year-old lady might be detrimental.
Right, yeah.
Mentally.
And especially, if she happens to have a heart condition or anything like that,
Definitely.
there are pretty big concerns. So it's... I know the potency limits when they were getting established in Oregon were kind of controversial.
Definitely.
People were upset about them.
I was upset about them.
Yeah, really?
I see the validity in it now way more than I did back then. Not having all the calls at ERs, not having newspaper articles all the time and all the scuttlebutt about the negativity about edibles. Not the pros outweigh the cons.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Are there... That's a good segue into something else I wanted to ask you. Are there... What sort of ideas about cannabis or the industry did you have early on that have changed compared to now that you've been operating for so long and seen so much change? What are some ideas of yours that have kind of been influenced and changed?
I think the broadest thing I could speak of is just the general benefit of cannabis for people. I knew there was some benefit coming into this, but pretty anecdotal in 2009.
Yeah.
Definitely way less, and not having an industry to study. The information wasn't really there. I knew it could be beneficial to certain situations, but over the years, with all the education coming out and being within the industry at the forefront and helping people, it's amazing what it can do. It's definitely not a miracle drug.
Right. Nothing is.
Yeah, it doesn't relate to everything at all times, but at the same time, I've seen some pretty impressive situations, arthritis, cancer, mental issues, depression, people trying to get off drugs and alcohol, addictive substances has been one I've worked with personally. That I think that's the biggest thing, is just watching it progress and to see it actually work on people and having firsthand experience, not necessarily reading about it or seeing a TV show,
right,
but firsthand watching these people gain something from cannabis. Topicals with arthritis, I never knew about when I got started.
Yeah, topicals were kind of scoffed at in the beginning of the industry. Like, oh, you can make those, but why would you? When you can just smoke or vape or eat edibles or whatever. And that's something I've definitely seen too. And I personally use topicals fairly frequently. I've got all sorts of back issues that if I can, it depends on, every topical is very different, but if I find the right one, it's amazing how it can really provide some significant relief to sort of like neuropathic pain that I felt, and that's something firsthand I can relate to as well.
Something outside the box on that is you can mix a little RSO in with your topical to make it a little more potent if
Boost
you're finding it's not working. Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
One of my employees has gotten to the point where she's only using basically RSO on her problem area as a topical.
Just directly, yeah.
A little more horsepower, if you will.
Yeah, I've seen that reported with some people are trying to treat like skin cancers and stuff, and they'll just put it directly on there. And from what I've seen, some people, it doesn't work with everybody, but some people seem to get pretty drastic results. Like things just disappear.
I have seen one skin reaction from that, by the way. Interesting
Really,
enough.
a negative
yeah.
reaction.
Negative reaction, yeah. Just a bumpy rash, bumpy red rash came from that area where they put that RSO on.
Yeah.
So I think it might be too strong in some instances.
Right, and some people might have allergies.
Exactly.
Yeah, either to cannabis broadly or certain compounds that are concentrated in extracts like that. That'll be interesting to tease out as more and more information comes along. And I plan on interviewing a variety of doctors and nurses and try to get their perspective on some of that. 'Cause, the allergy thing is something I've gotten questions about. There's just not a lot of good data on what to expect. I had one guy call me one time, a cultivator, that said that he couldn't be in a grow room anymore because the reactions, he just over time got more and more sensitized to, you know, whatever it is about cannabis, and that he'd just break out in these rashes, itch, and, you know, to the point just feeling painful. And then, you know, even anybody that had been near plants or clothes that he had that had rubbed against plants, like he had to get it all away.
That sensitive?
Yeah, very, very sensitive. He
Wow.
said it got to the point where he felt like he needed to be in a clean room or something in order to settle back down. And allergies can be that way, you know, with repeated exposure. Depending on the allergy, it can just get worse and worse and worse. And for him, because he had been growing for decades,
Right.
and, you know, early on had no issues, but, you know, 15 years into it or something, all of a sudden, it just got to the point where he couldn't even grow anymore.
I believe it.
And so just little things like that we don't necessarily think about until we feel more comfortable sharing stories and people, you know, start talking about the stuff and you learn that it's going on.
I think my ex-wife, when we'd pick fan leaves off our plants and stuff, certain strains would give her a rash and certain strains wouldn't affect her at all. So I always equated it to a terpene profile that people are allergic to.
It could be, yeah. And some people react to outdoor and not indoor because some of the environmental exposure with outdoor plants, different pollen from other plants, non-cannabis plants that can get on the plant, or, you know, just all sorts of stuff blowing in the air that can get on the plants. I've heard stories about that too, that people that are fine if they interact with indoor cannabis, but outdoor they just have these allergic reactions. It's cannabis just will forever get more and more complicated the more we learn and understand.
It's a freaking rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So let's assume that someone is getting ready to go to a dispensary for the first time. What are some things that you would like people to understand before visiting a dispensary? Some really basic stuff to ensure that their experience is, you know, the most positive that can be.
That's a tough one because the first-time consumer, where do they go to get education?
Oh, well, that's a great place to start.
You know,
Yeah.
Leafly, different things like that. A lot of people haven't heard of what websites we do have to go to.
Mm-hmm.
But if there was resources for people to gain knowledge on it, I would say study testing. Testing's a huge misconception within the industry, if you will.
Yeah.
We've had several conversations,
Mm-hmm.
more than a handful, I'm sure, about potency of cannabis and what testing means.
How to interpret
How
that
to interpret
information.
it.
Yeah.
What are terpenes? Those type of things through the testing. So if they would look at the testing, if they had access to be able to look at the testing and see the test results, start asking questions and get a full understanding of the testing, I think is a huge part of it. There's so many misconceptions within that. There needs to be a lot of education, I believe, for the consumer
Yeah.
to do. Understanding that cannabis is like alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
I think would be a good first timer, something to know. A lot of people ask, you know, how much do I smoke? How much do I consume? All these different questions about consumption of the product. And the best thing that we can tell the consumer is it's like alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Just take a little bit, see how you feel. Like you don't go to the store and buy 151, down half a bottle
Right.
to see what alcohol is like. You go have a drink and work into it slowly, if you will,
Yeah.
to get the best
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. Find your optimum level.
Knowing that, what else?
I think the testing piece is super huge because basically what you're saying is if you don't understand some basic things around how products are tested, what cannabinoids are, what terpenes are, you're not going to be able to interpret a certificate of analysis even if you ask for one, which is something I take for granted because something that I preach is consumers ask for the C of A, look for the C of A so that you understand what's actually been tested for, what the quality actually is, in contrast to whatever marketing terms are used on the products themselves. And I think I do take for granted a lot that consumers a lot of them don't necessarily know how to even interpret a test report, even if they ask for one, and in which case then they're going to rely on a dispensary technician or somebody to help them work through that. And so then you've got to hope that the dispensary technician understands all of that. So yeah, I think that's and then the start low, go slow model with consumption. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with those as a starting point. It's like,
It's super important. If somebody comes in, like we were talking about the old lady with the 400 milligram bar, if she smashed that thing, cannabis would have been the worst thing in the world she had ever
right,
experienced.
and she'd never try it again. And
versus 5 milligrams, a little bit of CBD in there,
mm-hmm.
would have been a pleasurable experience, hopefully enlightening for what she was looking for at that level. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's huge for the first timer, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the misconceptions that you're running into when people come into the dispensary and they're hunting for product? One thing that you and I talk about a lot is THC shopping, and then now I'm sure CBD shopping is probably another thing. But and maybe we'll get into that. But yeah, what are some of the main misconceptions that you kind of see over and over and over again?
I think one of the, like we talked about before, the main one is the THC number.
Mm-hmm.
So many people rely on that when they make their choice of purchase. They're really missing out on a lot of other good products that would probably do just the same thing, and they
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't know any different.
Yeah. So you see a lot of people just coming in the dispensary just saying, what's your highest THC flower? What's your highest THC?
Definitely. I've had people
extract?
tell me that they can't smoke anything under 25% because it doesn't get them high. When I beg to differ.
Yeah.
I've smoked plenty of 18% recently, even after dabbing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The 18%, it's such a minuscule amount that's bioactively available, that
Mm-hmm.
20 to 30%, by the time the body actually consumes it, that's such a small amount. I don't know anybody that could really tell me the difference between 20 and 30% when they smoked it.
Yeah.
Terpenes are, terpenes come into effect. Some allow you to get more high, some allow you not to get as high.
Mm-hmm.
So the terpene profile of the flower could have you could have a 30%er with the wrong terpene that actually closes the receptor. You don't get as high as a 20%er that had the terpene that opened up receptors. You would actually be getting a better purchase
Right.
value at that 20% if that's what you're looking for.
Right. Yeah. And there's so much we don't even know yet about how some of these compounds influence those entourage effects.
Flavonoids.
And yeah, there's flavonoids. There's all sorts of different little other compounds that you're going to find that are in minor concentrations, but all in all, when you're administering all of these chemicals together, they're all tugging on receptors and doing different things, influencing things and influencing your own endocannabinoid system, stimulating endocannabinoid production, which then go and tug on receptors and have their own effects too. And so it's, our minds have this funny way of trying to simplify things down. And it's a survival strategy for us to make our way through the world. We've got to simplify things, but We have to be super careful.
Bigger's not always better.
Yeah, bigger, more is not best. And I've had experiences consuming cannabis flower that's as low as 13%, and have had more pleasurable experiences with that than things that are 25, 27. And then there's also the fact that if you get one product tested over and over and over again, you're going to see a spread of potency values, and usually the potency value that's being reported on a product is what was captured for that regulatory testing that needed to be done, but there's actually that flower that's testing at 27%. Well, you could also see it at 25, 24%. You may even see it at 28.
Over time, right? It'll degrade also.
And over time it's going to change. And over time, the terpenes are going to change. You're going to have monoterpenes that are volatilizing off, that are really lightweight, and leaving sesquiterpenes behind that have their own effects. And so, honing in on just the THC value can be misleading for a number of reasons.
CBN, I always like to talk about CBN. If you had a flower at 27% and 5% CBN,
Yeah.
wow, you know what I mean? So just looking at the percentage of CBN should be included in looking at THC numbers. There's other cannabinoids that should be looked at too. If you're looking at, I want to get the most high I can possibly get off this 1 gram of flower that I'm gonna buy.
Mm-hmm.
That THC value is a fallacy.
Yeah.
There's too many other cannabinoids, like we said, and terpenes, like we said, involved. That number's almost insignificant.
Right. Yeah.
Would you agree?
I do agree. I think that what I usually recommend to people is starting out is to try to be blind to the THC number and focus on organoleptic properties. How does it smell? How does it look? What does the resin content actually look like? If you're this is in the context of flower,
Copy.
but going off of all these other indications, and then trying some different things. I always recommend journaling, keeping good notes when you're starting out, or if you're trying to get a certain outcome. And this is the scientist in me. It's like, take notes. And I know not everybody's going to do that, but I really recommend it. And try to be blind to some of that information at first, and then capture it later. And you might surprise yourself at what you end up liking. And it most likely will not be the product with the highest THC concentration. It might be, but most likely it won't be.
I think more times than not it would not.
I totally agree. And over time, just my perspective on cannabis has changed a lot. And so, especially coming out of working in labs, that I just don't care about the THC number at all. And so, and strain names. I could care less about strain names too. That's just totally meaningless. And maybe you can comment on that. What are your thoughts on strain names? Because that's kind of a controversial one, that some people are really invested in there being a lot of value in strain names. I fall on the end of the spectrum that thinks they're almost meaningless. They have some value, but very, very limited.
I see it as wine, always have. You can buy box wine down at your local market, or you can go to a specialized store and buy a unique bottle at an expensive price.
Right.
I do believe at the box level wine, the commercial large cultivation practices, the strain names are almost irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
They're pumping out so much at a commercial rate. This is just my belief. A lot of it's just the same. It's just commercial. It's just pumped out. Not a lot of care given. Just want to get it out. So strain names in that category, I think, are less important. Once you get into the craft side of things, you get to that expensive bottle of wine of cannabis, if you will, with craft cultivators that are chasing the lineage that on the strains that they are growing, and they are doing their due diligence to make sure that the strain they're cultivating is from that lineage. I mean, they got the right cut from the mom, so to speak. I think at that level, it's super important. And just super important at that level. People that are paying high dollar for a gram want to know what they're smoking.
Right.
Strain names. People that are just grabbing something to get high and going down the river, or whatever the case might be. There are certain certain levels within the industry care about that.
Mhm.
Certain levels within the industry don't care about that.
Yeah.
So some sectors it will be big.
Yeah, and there is a
The
lot
problem
of...
is people renaming strains.
Well, so that's exactly what I was going to get into, is even when a lot of care is taken to try to ensure that you're as loyal as you can be to where your genetics have originated from.
It's always the commercial guys that are changing the name.
Well, and there's changing name. There's also mistaken, just genuine accidental mislabeling
Total.
of strain
Human
names
error,
that happens.
100.
Yeah. And then there's, the fact that something under the same strain name grown in different conditions can yield different chemotypes.
100.
And so you can get very different effects from the same strain depending on how it was grown, what sort of environmental stresses it experienced. And
Sour diesel and East Coast sour diesel are supposedly the same genetics, but they're two different different smokes, if two different terpene profiles.
Right.
I believe personally, due to the environmental differences of New York and California, so to speak.
And even
West Coast, East Coast.
Indoor and outdoor.
Indoor, outdoor. I've
and-
set up several indoor rooms, and I always found that to be super interesting. Is I would identically mimic my indoor rooms,
Mm-hmm.
and I would always have different results in each room.
Yeah.
I would try to, make perfect temperature, perfect humidity, CO2, everything was identical, or at least I thought.
Right.
But I always had a different product. Slightly.
Slightly,
To a grower growing, I could notice. Some people couldn't.
Right.
But there was a difference I could notice.
Right, and I think that's a good point too. There are qualities that seem to be consistent, and chemotype isn't the only quality. And so, like, growth forms and stuff like that tend to be consistent for the most part. But there'll be some like color variations, variations to the flower structure itself that you notice, as well as the chemotype. And then I'm really excited. I'm going to be doing an interview later in August with somebody who lives overseas that goes around. Their job is to collect genetics from Asia and Africa of as best as they can find. So these old school genetics, trying to trace things back as far as they can.
Going for land races?
Yeah. And one misconception I think a lot of people have is that if you take a landrace strain from, Thailand or something, or from Afghanistan, much better example, and then try to grow it out here, even though you're dealing with the original, as best as you can, the original genetics, you're still going to end up with a different, slightly different product because of the environment being different, and just all sorts of variables.
Thing that come to my mind instantly was the soil. The soil in Afghanistan's got a certain level of nutrients in every category. It's here and there.
Yeah.
Versus, indoor, somebody brings it from Afghanistan, brings it here and does it indoor on salts.
Right.
It's a totally different feeding regimen. And you know what happens to humans if you eat McDonald's your whole life versus vegetables your whole life. So you produce two different products at that level.
Right, yeah.
So just the soil variations of what it's eating.
Yep, and it's like just the way it's grown. Ancient cultures grew cannabis a little differently than some people do today.
I think humidity and temperature plays a huge effect on
I think
look.
humidity is a big one. That's something I'm really interested to understand, that we'll probably understand a lot better really soon, especially now that hemp is legal in the United States, and we're going to see cannabis grown all over the country in places where it hasn't been grown very much before, especially in the southeastern states. Might get a better sense of how humidity and things like that are influencing cannabinoids, terpenes, all of that.
Having cultivated indoors and having fluctuations and doing a lot of research and development on different levels of temperature and humidity and CO2 levels, humidity plays a huge difference on the structure of the plant.
Yeah.
From what I can tell.
Yeah.
Anecdotally.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense.
Question for you: now that hemp's legal and the FDA allows it, the major holdup of doing any kind of major research on cannabis has been the legalities, being in Schedule 1.
Mm-hmm.
But now that hemp's legal and people are growing it, when is the research going to start on the hemp at a major level.
It's already gearing up. So
That's going to provide us with a lot of information that I believe transitions into cannabis nicely.
yeah, I totally agree. It's something that hasn't received a ton of attention, but it, as a scientist, has me really excited. I've talked with at least one university so far that is working on onboarding a hemp research program, just helping them understand some basic things around testing, cultivation, extraction, all sort of stuff, so they can kind of get caught up in in figuring that out. Because now that hemp is legal, I guarantee you most major universities are in the process of onboarding hemp research programs.
Nice.
And the consequence, though, is a lot of the people that are being put in charge of running these programs are new to cannabis.
I believe
At least in any sophisticated way. They might have tried cannabis before or be a user, but as far as being exposed to a cannabis industry and being exposed to cultivation, extraction, product manufacturing, testing, all that sort of stuff, it's all very new. And so there's a bit of a learning curve, but what I've told other people is even though there's a learning curve, I think they will surpass that learning curve very quickly, because there's a lot of information available, a lot of knowledgeable people that have been operating in places where they could work with cannabis legally, that those gaps will get filled pretty quickly.
Israel being one of those places.
Oh yeah, Israel's huge. Spain, and then there are a lot of countries, kind of trying to rush to get a foothold in the international market, whether it be CBD-rich, quote-unquote, hemp or THC-rich cannabis. New Zealand has made some rules to try to get medical cannabis going and get clinical trials going. There are countries in South America that are trying to very quickly get like industrial scale cannabis cultivation going. So, it's a snowball effect that we knew was happening, and the rate is picking up, just faster and faster. It's an exponential growth model, it seems to be. And so the amount of data that's going to come out of all of that is honestly overwhelming to think about, because already there's so much research coming out every month that I can barely keep up with it. I can't keep up with it. And it's just going to increase. And so it's really, really exciting. And it's going to take us years to kind of dig through all this data that's going to be coming out and make sense of it. And one thing I'm interested in on the dispensary side is seeing more like survey research going on to try to tease out why people are using cannabis, what effects they're experiencing from that, how successful has it been in treating different sorts of medical conditions. I'm really interested to understand medical conditions that are resistant to cannabis, and trying to understand what conditions people have tried to treat with cannabis that just don't seem to work so well.
Right.
Because I've heard different stories, but I want to see a big data set and really start to tease that out, see if we notice patterns, so that we can drive better education and better consumer awareness, and just take things up a level. And coming back around to what you were saying before of, the nice thing about Oregon having regulations, having, limits on things, is that you're able to compare to other states where you're seeing ER visits, all of this, sort of results of either bad education or just regulation that's not necessarily valuing public health and safety as much as others.
Lack of education.
Yeah, I think it does come down to a lack of education. It's one reason I'm so passionate about the education work that I do, because I firmly believe in all areas of life that more education overall tends to lead to better decision making, better behaviors, as far as decision making and behaviors that help you achieve what you actually want.
Agreed.
And so, yeah, I think there's going to be a series of growing pains, I'm sure, that cannabis broadly is going to go through, especially as this patchwork of regulations keeps going. The federal government's talking about rescheduling cannabis. They talk about it and talk about it, but they just had a very serious conversation about it recently, I believe, in the House. And it's at this point, it's gotten to be one of those things where it's like, I'll believe it when it happens. But
I thought it was going to happen a long time ago.
right, yeah. I've gotten excited several times about the potential of rescheduling, how that would affect research possibilities, among other things. But
it'll redirect a lot.
it will. It'll change a lot. But yeah, we'll kind of see what's in store for the future. But what do you want to see from the future of the cannabis industry broadly, and as well as any other aspects of cannabis that interest you? What do you want to see from the future?
Broadly, looking at the industry from outside in, so to speak, a little more organization, education within the companies that are operating, I think is dramatic. I see a lot of people fumbling and going forward and backwards and forward again and backwards again. So looking at the industry, for companies to become mature
Yeah.
in what they're doing, and that education piece, I mean, we're all learning every day. So having everybody be further educated to make those better decisions within their companies, I think is going to be super important on watching the cream rise to the top, if you will.
Yeah.
Some of the companies and the way they operate is just, it's not acceptable. And over a period of time, it's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah.
So the people that are educating themselves heavily and doing the right thing business structure-wise, come to the top. I want to see that within the industry, more professionalism,
Yeah.
I guess, is the basis of it. Within the industry, it's pretty much all about regulatory at this point in time, in my personal opinion. The way the OLCC structured Oregon, the way certain cities and counties have decided to operate, not putting up any zoning restrictions as far as separation distances between dispensaries. To where you have a small demographic city with a large population of dispensaries, Starbucks in every corner model.
Right.
It waters down the industry to a point where nobody's doing any good.
Right. It makes it very difficult for anyone to succeed.
To operate, to do bigger, better things. It's more of a survival situation at this point due to the regulatory board. So, I mean, now they're talking about reducing the licenses of producers, not renewing anymore, limiting the amount of licenses of producers within the state now, to look at consumption within areas and how much cultivation or producing needs to be done to solidify that. So the regulatory board model is going to change over time, over the next probably 3 to 5 years. I'm just speculating.
Yeah.
And that's going to manipulate the industry quite a bit. So I guess within the industry, what I'm looking for is, again, for the regulatories to become more educated within the system, which they are. They're looking at things now and they're becoming educated what's going on. They didn't know too much when they started. Bless their heart, they weren't in the industry, so they didn't know. So now they jumped in, had to. They're slowly learning. So I think once they get their head wrapped around the business end of things and what needs to happen for people to succeed in Oregon, that's what I'm looking for. Limiting producers, possibly putting zoning restrictions eventually. Eugene's got like 100 dispensaries. Middle-sized demographic in Oregon. You got over 100 dispensaries. So I'm hoping within the industry, the regulatory board will start looking at some of the problems within the industry and start correcting that through changes within the law to allow good businesses to operate
Right. Foster
more freely.
Foster good competition rather than I mean, when you get into
Oversaturation.
when you get into that saturated market and everyone's trying to survive, that creates pressure to cut corners. It tends to drive lower quality.
Pricing wars.
Yeah, all sorts of other issues that come into place can become really big issues.
Dispensaries common walled together, where they share a common wall.
Mm-hmm.
Their addresses are one number apart. That shouldn't happen within any industry. So for any city or county to allow that, I'm hoping the OLCC will look at that. And eventually, as some shops close up due to the nature of the demographics within the area, that they won't allow relicensing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for within the industry.
Yeah, I could see that as a reasonable way forward. It's, you can't, it's much more difficult to snatch up licenses, shut someone down that has already gotten through the system, but just, not reissuing things or if a company closes down, just saying it's not like a new license opens up. It's just like, no, we're trying to bring that down.
I believe they're doing that with cultivation as people are switching over to hemp or not continuing with their business anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they're not issuing any licenses. I know we're down about 50 licenses in Jackson County on cultivation side, and I believe they're not reissuing any.
Yeah.
So the numbers are coming down.
Well, overproduction is a huge issue, and I'm
yes and no.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
There's overproduction. There's X amount of pounds in metric in the state system, but within that, let's say I know there's over 1 million, but let's just say there's 1 million pounds. I would speculate 50% of that 500,000 pounds is cannabis that's not worthy of smoking, possibly. Quality's not there.
Yeah.
So many new farms came in and tried to open up shop. Their level of quality compared to an established medical grower that's been around and knows his soil and his conditions, able to knock it out of the park. There's that level of knowledge within cultivation.
Yeah.
So, there's a large percentage of that nobody wants to smoke. So even though there's overproduction, I'm starting to see it now where farms are running out of flower and dispensaries are calling them for more flower, and they sound stressed out because they can't get more flower from them, so they're having a hard time finding the flower that's working for them at their dispensary. So there's a shortage of good cannabis, and there's an overproduction of bad cannabis, to put it shortly.
Well, that segues into one of my favorite topics, which is product quality and quality management.
That's one thing that's not talked about in the Oregon market that's very disheartening to me, is the quality. Everybody wants to talk about pricing. I got this strain, I got this number, but the actual quality of the cannabis, very few people actually talk about.
Well, let's talk about it now. How do you, when a vendor comes to you and wanting to sell your dispensary product, what's running through your mind when you're not only evaluating the quality of the product, whether it be flower, extract, or whatever, but also the company itself as well? Because as a business owner, I'm sure you're looking at this of like, it's not just bringing in product, but I'm developing a relationship with this business as well. And
Definitely.
So there are other dynamics too. So yeah, what's going through your mind there?
A lot of dispensaries operate on different models. I'm pretty old school in my morals. When I decide to carry a company's product, I develop a relationship with them, keep an open communication, and have a business relationship. And I continue to carry their product because it's continually good and it's a continuous product. So the first thing, I make sure the product's something I want, and then it's having conversations with the people that are selling it. If it's a distribution company, I'll call the company that they're trying to sell the product for to get further information.
Yeah.
And then you can really gain a sense of knowledge about what's going on within that company by talking to these people and their level of education and what they're talking about. Then after that, it's looking at I tend to look at operations, how they're cultivating, where they're throwing their waste, just different little practices of cleanliness. So it's a complete evaluation of the company as well as the product. Being in the regulated market, being in the metric system where everything's tracked, seed to sale. I can't find an industry that's regulated more heavily than we are right now. The only
Yeah.
thing I can find is hazardous waste.
Right.
Nothing is manifested from producer to retail.
Right. Complete chain of custody.
Complete chain
yeah.
of custody. Cannabis is its own little animal like that, and there's not too many things regulated more highly. So being in that model, it's super important to me to be able to work with businesses that have professionalism
Mm-hmm.
and have their eggs all in one basket, if you will. No, that's the wrong term.
They've got their shit together.
You got their shit together, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
There's so many steps overlooked within the industry that I get emails from the OLCC saying I have a potential violation because so-and-so transferred this edible as an extract,
Oh.
or this extract is edible, or the package is wrong.
Right.
in
The
some
weight was wrong.
some
or,
fashion.
Yeah.
So to not have a relationship with that company, trying to get a hold of them to get the situation corrected becomes painstaking.
Yeah.
So to work with companies that I can have a business relationship with, that answer their phone and act professional, those are the type of relationships that I cherish because we can handle the situations, everything. It's sustainable practice.
Right.
Working with certain companies that are answering their phone one week, able to produce product this week, we might get to you next week.
Mm-hmm.
Just the level of professionalism in some of the businesses in the Oregon rec market is pretty unacceptable. I've found hair in flour before, and I contact the person unharshly, like, hey, I found hair in your flour, what do you want to do about it? And every instance I've been in has been a negative response. The last one was the cultivator sent me an article on what the FDA allows in food products. rat poop and all these different things that the FDA says is allowable in food.
In extremely trace amounts.
It's in extremely trace amounts, but it's still allowable. And I
Right.
just found it to be completely unacceptable.
Right.
We smoke this stuff. We're not eating it, and I don't care about the FDA.
And it's
When I'm-
going directly in your lungs, directly in your bloodstream.
Yeah, I don't want anything other than the flour that was grown. I don't care what the other substance might be. Hair is disgusting. I don't want to smoke it. I believe I've smoked hair before, and it tastes extremely nasty.
Yeah.
Probably the health benefits aren't there either.
Well, as a sidebar, real quick, I mean, that's an important distinction to make is quality standards for food and quality standards for things that you would inhale
Two different levels.
are two very different levels. And I think a lot of people don't understand that or stop to recognize that when you eat something, you have your liver that helps you deal with contaminants. And obviously you don't want to pound your liver with things that, shouldn't be processing, but that's one of the beautiful things about the liver is that it is an organ that can break some of these things down, filter them out. But when you're heating something up and inhaling it, you're bypassing that metabolic process.
There's zero protection.
Yeah, it's going anything that can pass through the membranes in your lungs and get to the bloodstream, it's going to, and then it's going to get distributed throughout your body. And so the idea of claiming
Allowable
food
traces.
standards for something that's going to be inhaled, that doesn't apply. And it's an argument that I got into some people with early on when the pesticide regulations were being established, because people said, well, they
Right.
allow these pesticides on food, and it's like, well, you're not smoking your food.
The level of pesticide in beer is astronomical.
Yeah, and there are issues with that too. I'm not happy about
Right.
levels of pesticide in foods or anything either. But you're not smoking these things. You are at least allowing your liver to take care of some of that and protect you.
Right.
So just as an aside, it's very important distinction. Just because you might allow rat poop in food doesn't mean you should be smoking it.
100%. 100. So there again, the professionalism among some of the businesses is not quite there.
Yeah.
So getting some of those people weeded out, I think, is super important.
Yeah. What are some other examples of poor quality that you've seen come through getting into other products, like with extracts or topicals or edibles, that sort of thing?
Extracts, I've seen a race to the bottom, people processing 2-year-old trim.
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
Coming to me looking pretty bad. I can see the harvest date. It's like, I
Right.
can tell the material's 2 years old. I mean, you can trace it back.
And is there anything you notice as far as color?
Oh, got it. It looks
texture?
like motor oil that's been in the motor for 30,000 miles. It's just black tar.
Yeah.
There's a certain level of darkness that an extract can have. It can be a little bit on the darker side due to certain things. You know, CBN is a darker compound, so if it has more CBN, it's gonna be a little bit darker. But I'm talking black tar, grossness.
Smells like burnt hair.
Yeah, I think distillate has too strong of a hold on the marketplace.
It's gotten really popular. I've noticed.
I believe it to be a poor quality product. The reason distillate was even thought of or initiated was to get rid of pesticides out of dirty oil, so somebody could take pesticide-ridden cannabis oil, distillate,
And just try to pull the cannabinoids out and leave
pull the
everything
cannabinoids,
behind.
and they're able to leave the pesticides. So they're able to clean up dirty material. That's the only reason distillate was even introduced into our industry. So to see it gain a strong hold and see all the material that they're stripping out, all the good material, I think a full spectrum oil is way more beneficial, even if you're just trying to get high, than a distillate. Even though the distillate has a higher THC number,
Right.
we could start talking about burning temperatures and different things like that. Just because you have a 90% extract doesn't mean you're going to get higher than a 70%. If you burn a 70% a little bit hotter than a 90%, you're going to get higher than a 90%.
Right.
So there again, that number becomes marginal again at the end of the day. But distillate, it's a huge.
Well, it's gotten really big in the hemp CBD markets because of the pressure to remove THC from extracts. So
Right.
there's the sort of processing pathway that I am seeing more and more frequently in the CBD market is doing these primary extractions, whether it be ethanol or CO2 or whatever, then doing distillation so that you get these numbers really high. You get that CBD up to 80%, 85% or whatever, and then doing usually some form of chromatography to remove the THC out. So then you've boosted that number a little more because you've pulled out THC and some other fractions that you don't want. And so you end up with this super, super thick distillate product, heavily refined product that's primarily CBD, almost 85 to 90% CBD with some other cannabinoids in there. And I see some of these products labeled full spectrum. And that's something that I've been harping on a lot lately, just the term full spectrum.
I've seen it on distillate. I just saw it today on a distillate cart. Full spectrum distillate.
Yeah, and I'm like, what does that mean? And I think I've teased out why that's happening. What manufacturers are telling me is like, oh, that refers to the cannabinoid spectrum. And that, in distillation, we're still maintaining the cannabinoids. I'm like, okay, that may or may not be true. I don't know if it's even possible to verify that.
I don't think it is.
I don't know any labs that are testing for the hundreds of cannabinoids that are actually present when you start getting into the minors.
Not at our level.
No. Or even labs that are testing for, the dozen or more primary cannabinoids. Usually at best you might see test result that hits 7 to 12 cannabinoids.
Right.
And so there's that piece. But also I just think it's super misleading and confusing to consumers.
Who says straight CBD isolated from everything else does anything beneficial for your body?
Well, I mean,
what's the benefit of isolating CBD?
That's a big argument, is how does a heavily refined CBD product, or THC product for that matter, affect somebody compared to a broader spectrum extract? A lot of that data doesn't exist beyond.
There was a little bit of data out of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where there was a scientist that was, way more about this than I do, but there was a scientist studying cannabinoids in cancer in lab rats.
Mm-hmm.
Full spectrum, it was able to put the lab rats with cancer into remission.
Right.
He started isolating compounds, and I remember CBD, he specifically isolated CBD compound and was given to the lab rats with cancer, and they all died of the cancer. So he went back to a full spectrum, and then was able to put the cancer in remission again. So the full spectrum is really important. All these isolated compounds, I believe, don't do nearly as much, if they do anything, nearly as much as a full spectrum, everything that was involved to begin with.
Well, it's just they're just very different products. And I'll try to find that paper and see if I can link it when I end up posting this. But
that's a good one.
There have been some other studies, too, that have looked at dose response curves. So how so basically you'll have some marker that you're looking at to indicate whether something is an effective treatment. And in the study that I'm thinking of, it's, I believe it's an inflammatory marker or something like that.
Copy.
And when administering these full spectrum extracts, and I need to go back and look at what they meant by full spectrum. I'm sure they didn't use the term full spectrum, but when they were giving these broader spectrum extracts, I believe it's to mice or rodents in general, they were finding that as they increased dosage, the benefit got better and better, whereas when they administered isolate, they hit a peak, and then they started to see negative effects as dosages increased. And so with the isolate, you saw this bell curve where you'd get benefit, and then level out and then go down. Whereas with the broader spectrum extract, it seemed to be more of a linear, line.
Copy.
And so there's some little data like that, but not a lot of good. There's, to my knowledge, and I could be totally wrong, so someone out there correct me. I'm totally open to being wrong. I feel like I'm wrong about all sorts of things all the time. But I don't think there's been any human clinical trials looking at these types of effects yet.
Not that I've seen. It's been all rodent.
Yeah. They're rodent at best. And so it'll be interesting to tease that out. And I try to be careful about talking about broad spectrum extracts and isolate and what they do or don't do, because we just don't know. But I do have a lot of friends that do clinical work with patients and that can report anecdotally that they've seen that they get the best responses, typically from ethanol-based extracts that maintain a broader spectrum of phytochemistry. They tend to get better results at lower dosages with fewer side effects.
Agreed.
And I have personal friends that have reported the same thing. Obviously, I know as a scientist that's not enough to extrapolate to, a population as big as, the state of Oregon or, the country of the United States or the world, but it does create an argument of why we need to look more closely at that, for sure.
Turns the light bulb on.
Yeah, it turns the light bulb on, for sure.
I've been able to participate with a couple people looking for medical benefits from cannabis, and for their type of situation, it was definitely eating cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got documentation from MD Imaging, an imaging company, on a gentleman particularly that had liver cancer,
Mm-hmm.
had a quarter-sized lesion on his liver that was pronounced in the image.
Yeah.
And we put him on RSO, long story short, full spectrum cannabinoids. And out of 3 images, we were able to see the image shrink.
Wow.
This is all anecdotal. There's other things involved. Western medicine was involved at the time.
Right.
But it didn't shrink until we did administer cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
In about 2 or 3 months, we did see it. So full spectrum in my mind and my belief system does work. And I have seen zero, and this is my own world,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen zero benefits from isolate.
Well, and you're actually touching on another really important point in that cannabis, what some of the data that's coming out, and even data with actually approved pharmaceutical cannabinoid products, is that cannabinoids can be great adjunct treatments with other traditional therapies. And so if someone is going through cancer treatment and they add cannabinoids to that treatment, it may actually make the cancer drugs, the chemotherapy, work better and help their body handle the assault that some of those drugs sometimes have on the body better. Directly, some strong data for this is in the Epidiolex studies for isolated CBD.
Really?
That have shown that one misconception with Epidiolex is that it's to treat epilepsy. And it's like, yeah, it is to treat epilepsy, but really it is designed to be an adjunct treatment to be administered with standard epileptic drugs to help those drugs work better. And I think that's something that we're going to end up seeing more and more of. I was on the phone with one of the researchers from the University of Mississippi years ago when I first moved out here and didn't know anybody, and started working in, helping getting these testing labs going. So it's like the only person I knew that had any experience with any of that. So I called him up, and I remember we got into a conversation. I was like, what do you think about all the CBD stuff and the epilepsy and everything? And a really nice guy. And he, he's been exposed to some of this research longer than almost anybody, and criticize the science coming out of the University of Mississippi all you want. I've been so directly connected to it that I don't think it deserves some of the hits that it gets regularly. But what this guy was saying is, like, he said, no, Jason, CBD will never be a standalone treatment for epilepsy. What it's going to be is an adjunct treatment. And he said, just watch. You're going to see that as more studies are done, that it's going to be when CBD is administered with other drugs that you see the most benefit, not when you have either one of them separated.
Really?
And then the Epidiolex studies verified that.
I never would have guessed in conjunction with.
Well, and it relates to how CBD affects the liver and how it affects the metabolism of drugs and how it can boost the levels of drugs in the blood and keep them from breaking down as long. And I think there's more to it than that. That's what gets talked about the most, but I think there's more going on as well, and how cannabinoids affect the endocannabinoid system, as well as just our concept of the endocannabinoid system is getting so broad. There are all these receptor types and activities in the body that cannabinoids are influencing that could influence the way another drug is behaving in the body. And,
negatively too.
Negatively too, yeah.
We've talked about that.
It's a double-edged sword.
Right.
It can cause negative effects. It can cause positive effects. It can cause people to lower dosages of pharmaceuticals. It can also potentially put someone in harm's way if they're not paying attention to the levels of drugs in their blood while they're taking cannabis products. And so this just gets into some of that nuance that future research is going to tease out, is what are the proper places for different cannabinoid therapies. And I think that isolated cannabinoids will have a place as a tool in the tool chest, but
once we understand them.
Once we understand them and understand that proper place.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think these broader spectrum extracts are also going to have a strong place as a therapeutic tool. And it's just figuring out in what instances, what conditions have to come together to get the best out of any of these tools that we have available to us.
If I had a medical condition personally and I was looking for something to eat cannabis-wise, it makes way more sense to go full spectrum and have all the chemical compounds and all the terpenes and everything involved, because we don't know exactly what we're getting the benefit from. Is it the THC? Is it the CBD? We don't know exactly. Is it the G's, N's? We don't know what the benefit is coming from. So having a full spectrum extract, eating that, you're having way better chances, way more odds, way better percentage of actually treating what you're trying to treat with more chemicals versus one.
Well, and especially given the safety profile.
Right.
And so, you're not going to kill yourself by, if you end up taking a little too much, you'd be uncomfortable, but you're not going to really put yourself in physical danger, with some rare exceptions. Whereas with, a lot of drugs, with isolated drugs, with the typical pharmaceutical model of picking one compound out or a couple compounds out and only using those have such strong effects on the body that, then you start to get into really dangerous situations. But the safety profile of cannabis is so wide, and it's like this with a lot of medicinal plants. Some medicinal plants, it's not that way, but cannabis is definitely one of these where the safety profile is so wide that you can afford to, and I'm not giving medical advice, this is my own opinion, but you can afford to experiment and start out with, different forms and try to find what works, and rather than jumping straight into the heaviest hitter, that being some of these isolated products that your body may not respond well to.
I saw a study a long time ago where they gave people in a controlled room straight THC, and most of them became, I forget the term they used, and I don't want to overstate myself, but they all got a little weird psychoactively with straight THC. And going full spectrum was
bring some balance.
What we're used to when we say high. Yeah, there's definitely balance to it.
I've tried Marinol before.
There you go.
And, that's 100% THC. And I can certainly say that the effects of Marinol are extremely, just night and day different than the effects of ingesting flower extract or any cannabis product. It's very, very different and undesirable. I've never wanted to re-experience that again. It's not that it was like an overwhelming intoxicating effect or anything like that. For me, it was just uncomfortable. I don't know how else to put it, but it just wasn't.
It's all psychoactive, isn't it?
It's psychoactive, but it just had this quality that it just didn't sit well with me. I felt uncomfortable the whole time, and I don't know. It was just a feeling I've never gotten from any other cannabis product. Even when I've, taken too much of a THC-rich cannabis product, it wasn't that same kind of like, oh, I'm too high. It was just like something doesn't feel right kind of experience. And that was just my personal experience and a one-off experience at that. But it was something where I was just like, okay, well, I've had that experience. I never want to do that again. It just wasn't interesting. And I can see why people ditch Marinol for herbal cannabis or extracts or whatever.
Definitely. Eating a full spectrum and eating an isolate would be a good comparison for somebody that was wondering what full spectrum and isolate really meant.
Mm-hmm.
Eating a THC distillate, not an isolate, but a distillate where it's 90% THC, if you will, is a completely different experience than eating a full spectrum made edible.
Yeah.
You can get the uncomfortable feeling from a distillate product quicker.
I could see that.
My experience, anyways.
And I haven't tried. I just haven't tried much distillate. But I could see that when you're getting to that level of concentration, be Marinol like.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking or
wondering. Yeah. Well, we're kind of getting towards the end here. I want to give you a chance if there's anything we haven't talked about that you're particularly interested in getting into, or any questions for me you want to get into or anything like that. I want to just kind of give you the platform to take this in any direction you want to.
Left the door wide open for me, didn't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
On-site consumption is something I'm looking forward to with regulatory boards getting a little more comfortable with cannabis and realizing it's not such a bad thing and it's not putting everybody in harm's way and people aren't driving and killing each other type thing.
Yeah.
On-site consumption is my next big hope.
And I may be wrong. It's been a while since I've tapped into what's going on in some of the regulatory changes in other states, but didn't Alaska approve that either statewide or in some places? I feel like a couple years ago I saw that they were trying that out, and
I don't remember the specifics.
Yeah.
I don't think it went very far though. I haven't heard anything, to be honest.
Yeah, once again, going back to the clandestine days of the medical program here in Oregon, there were clubs that you could go to and consume indoors. It was illegal, but
totally.
But they existed. That experiment has been done.
It's it's a funny thing, like looking at a bigger model for as far as on-site consumption in Las Vegas. In Nevada, we have legalized cannabis. You go to Las Vegas, let's just say, there's plenty of dispensaries now. So you can physically go buy cannabis legally, but there's no place in Las Vegas where you can legally consume cannabis. So it's a catch-22.
Right.
So there's still that element of breaking the law, even though cannabis is legal now and we should all goddamn relax, is that still that stigma's there. And I got to go behind a corner and try and get a couple hits in before somebody sees me, even though I bought the stuff legally.
Right.
I think that is the next prudent step for anybody within the industry to help navigate through, is to provide safe places where we can just put our hat down and smoke a joint and hold our head up and relax.
Well, and it's one of those things of we already know the risks associated with drinking and driving, and yet we have bars
Plenty of them.
and plenty of them, and accept that risk. And maybe that's part of the problem, is maybe people perceive cannabis to be so similar to alcohol that they view it as, if we allow that, it's going to make...
Or worse, drugs. I had a vet that used to take care of my dog, and I had him on RSO because of cancer. And I was telling the doctor about it, and we had this discussion about cannabis. And his big worry about cannabis was people driving on cannabis. Like, that was his biggest fear about cannabis, was people driving on it. So obviously he'd never even tried cannabis before.
Right.
And I think a lot of the regulatory boards are in that same boat, but they don't even know what the effect really is.
Well, it's really hard because, some of the research that's been done has shown that dealing with cannabis and driving is a lot harder than dealing with alcohol and driving, because if you're a chronic consumer, you're going to be affected way differently than if you're...
I eat 300 to 400 milligrams of THC every night. I
Yeah.
guarantee my system is just peaking at all times. So even 2 days and getting a drug test, I would be at elevated level.
Right, so trying to figure out any sort of blood level for THC doesn't correlate with intoxication or impaired driving ability. Even the field sobriety tests that are performed don't do that great of a job of deciphering from impaired driving or not.
Right.
And if you're a user that doesn't use cannabis very much, and then you do and you drive, you're gonna potentially have a lower level of THC in your blood than someone like you, who's using it every day and has developed a tolerance and is not impaired.
Right.
It just gets very, very confusing. It's hard for regulators to wrestle with, because they really, the first thing to think about is, okay, how do we apply the same model we have for alcohol for cannabis? And I really want to talk to some police departments about this, and I'm trying to reach out and try to see if they'll agree to talk to me about this. How do you deal with the issue of cannabis and driving? And it seems to get very subjective as far as how that's enforced.
Super subjective.
And so obviously that creates a problem, because then it's just a matter of where are you driving and where do you live, and how do the cops think about cannabis? Do they have a certain bias that they're going to enforce?
I've seen one study. I think it was AAA. I could be wrong. It was definitely somebody we heard of in the automotive industry. They did a study and showed that somebody that was high on cannabis was actually a safer driver than somebody that was not.
There have been studies that have shown that
People don't get as angry, not as in a rush.
They tend to not get as angry. They tend to drive a little slower, and they tend to have more awareness of their own impairment compared to alcohol.
Yeah,
because like alcohol, you get impaired and then you deny you're impaired, and you tend to take more risks and that sort of thing.
So I've heard.
Yeah, so I've heard.
Yeah.
Whereas with cannabis, people tend to recognize that they need to pay more attention, and they tend to take corrective behaviors for that impairment, like driving slowly, like looking, checking like four-way stops and stuff more. They'll do 3 checks, 4 checks before they go.
A little more paranoid than aggressive.
Yeah, more paranoid than aggressive, and sometimes that can relate to safer driving.
I think that was equating to,
Yeah, I don't want to make that a blanket statement and say that it's safe to drive on cannabis, but
just one study.
But definitely some of the research and informal work that's done seems to show that there are times where cannabis consumers can be safer drivers.
I think if you're an everyday consumer of cannabis, I think you're a better driver if you're slightly consuming.
Mm-hmm.
Just a personal thought.
Right. Just particularly with the tolerance piece, and the
if I stub my toe and I'm sober, I get a lot more aggravated than if I'm stoned and I stub my toe.
Right. Yeah.
It takes a level of takes a level of that.
Yeah. Well, and when you're angry, once again, you tend to react more impulsively, and
Definitely.
So I can totally see that for sure.
But I think on-site consumption it's obviously needed. Just looking at the Las Vegas model. In Oregon, we have plenty of people, we can go to their houses, private property with permission of the property owner is where we need to consume. And we have that here and there, but still it's not ideal. There should be places where we could go and consume. You got people that don't have any friends that live in an apartment where there's no smoking, so they can't consume anywhere legally.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a safe house, or bars for cannabis, if you will. And then we've had this discussion on talking about cannabinoid receptors and how they open and close with different cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm.
But CBD will close cannabinoid receptors and actually kick THC ones off and not let them attach.
Yeah, they can antagonize. Yeah.
I've done an experiment where I've dabbed a bunch of THC product and been at a certain level,
Mm-hmm.
and then dabbed a CBD rich or even an isolate,
Mm-hmm.
hemp live resin, I think is what it was,
Mm-hmm.
and actually have the high fall.
Interesting. Yeah.
So become less high
Yeah.
by consuming that heavy CBD product. So on-site consumption could even become where you'd have to take a dab of CBD isolate before you leave to make sure you're at a safe public level.
Or have some education around that if you're
Too high, here's something to help out.
Yeah, and there's more and more work going into coming especially out of the herbalism community, other herbs and different products that you can take to deal with that. And there's been sort of old school ideas on dealing with cannabis intoxication, like
Eating a mango.
yeah, drinking lemonade, or eating lemons, chewing on peppercorns. There's several different plants that seem to really help with that. And so getting some of that education out there, and I'll be interviewing a good friend of mine who's an expert in sort of herbal Chinese medicine, and we're going to talk about this concept more in depth of different plants and things that you can engage to deal with problematic highs. But I think that could definitely help with things. And yeah, I think the stigma piece is big. How do we get people more comfortable with the idea of people in their society using cannabis and being around, and then figuring out what regulatory structures are needed to help protect public health and safety as is reasonable, and how to meet some of the concerns that non-users have, whether well-founded or not. Those concerns need to be respected and heard, and
Agreed.
there has to be some meeting in the middle to make as many people as possible feel comfortable and okay with the world that they're sharing with each other.
Anybody over 21 should try it and consume cannabis one time so they at least understand
what it is.
Yeah, I get so many. Throughout the years, I've had so many people argue different facts when they've never even consumed cannabis, or lack of a better statement, they don't know what the hell they're talking about, due to lack of actually trying it at any one point in time, and just thinking it's the devil's drug. You know what I mean? There's so much of that stigma has been ingrained in a lot of people.
Yeah.
It really holds the industry back sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
On-site consumption's been held back just for that exact reason. Everybody's afraid of it.
Right. Well, and everyone has a different conception of what being high means,
True that.
especially if they've not consumed cannabis or haven't even, consumed alcohol or smoked a cigarette. There are people that are...
They see it the same as heroin.
Right. I mean, it's hard to understand what the difference is. They may know that there is a difference, but there's no context for what people mean when they're talking about these experiences. And so that's a gap to be overcome. And some of that just comes to communication among community members, like talking to people and not coming from a place of judgment, and trying to understand where someone's coming from. And if you're a non-user and feel more like anti-cannabis, you should still be comfortable talking to someone who is a cannabis user and trying to understand what their experience is like as best you can, without jumping straight into assumptions and
Lumping it
holding on to
drugs.
preconceived notions about things that may not even be based in reality in the first place. and we can all get along a little better. I think that's something that we should all want, is just to be able to coexist a little better.
Definitely, 100% on that one.
Well, wow, looks like we've gone about an hour and a half. That's awesome. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Gregg, thank you so much for being willing to take the time to sit down with me and chat. I'm sure we'll come up with other things we'll want to talk about later, so maybe we'll get a chance to sit down again some other time.
I'm always around.
Awesome. Sounds great. So all of you listening, if you want to learn more about the podcast, you can go to cacpodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, just about anywhere you find podcasts. And also, as always, if you want to support the podcast or any of the educational work that I'm doing, you can become a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Natural Learning Enterprises. And you can join for as little as $1, and you can get access to early content. All of these full-length interviews will be released there early before they go public. You also get access to exclusive content and Natural Learning Enterprises. Yep. And thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. Take it easy.